Welcome to the first episode of my new sketch series. I had a friend of mine suggest that I produce some tutorials showing you how best to tackle design sketching. This is going to be for beginners, but it can be translated to anyone who's interested in sketching in any design practice. So we're going to get straight into it and cover something. So today I did a small warm-up to show you what I'm going to be presenting to you today. So we're going to be designing a side sketch of a shoe. Nice and simple, no warm-up required, and let's get into it. So first of all, what you see in front of you, these are some of the utensils that we are commonly using. So a eraser we're not going to be touching, definitely not touching a pencil, a ballpoint pen, a Pilot fine liner, a Papermate flare, and the pièce de résistance, a pro marker. Now, for the majority of these videos, I'm going to be using pro markers to show you what to do, because pro markers are excellent utilities. They're extremely cheap to buy, and they have a chisel tip. Now, the whole point of design sketching is to show confidence and to be confident in the way that you work. Your work does not have to be a piece of art. It can be very basic, and it can be you. The thing that separates a good design sketcher from a bad one, or from a person who thinks they're bad, a poor design sketcher, is the level of confidence that they exude. If you do not find yourself to be good at drawing in 3 dimensions, then focus more on side views to begin with. And for the majority of these first few videos, I'm going to be focusing on side views because they are extremely important. Again, let me pull this page out and show you. A side view is able to communicate a lot of detail. It's able to communicate proportion, and it's easily understandable. Now, from this point, you can take the design further, because this might be a very interesting shape to work with. You can understand the front and the back. So you have all of these views. You already understand the drawing in itself. So we're going to do this again. Actually, let me change up the color. Let's see. Let's go with orange. Orange might be a bit more fun. I'm running with a very cheap and affordable pro marker case for these exercises, and I highly suggest you get one. So the idea of using this as opposed to using a pencil and even a ballpoint pen is that you cannot apply this lightly. Once you've applied a line on the page, it's there to stay. Okay? And that's important, because you start learning about how useful it is to take that mistake and revert it into something that can be useful and used again, and it can be something that actually aids in the design process. So let's get to it. Side views, again, extremely efficient way of communicating your drawing, so we're going to focus on that today. First thing to do when it comes to shoe sketching is to just work out your proportions. It's as basic as that. So we're going to start by drawing a small reference line at the heel and a reference line for the toe. So that's the length you're working with. Again, I apologize, the lines aren't straight and everything on the page. This is very loose, very chilled and relaxed. This is not going to be a work of art. It's going to be a communication drawing for you to see. The third line that we're going to be adding is a line that maybe helps you reference the height of the shoe itself. So I'll explain. First thing you want to do is draw a reference line that links up the heel of the shoe to the toe of the shoe. So for the sake of this exercise, I'm just going to round off the bottom and pull a line there. So now immediately we have an arc to the heel. From that point, you then create an arc to the toe. There we go. Now, because it's a sports shoe, we're going to keep it quite nice and low in profile. So there's the continuation of the arc. We pull it round. And let's finish it off by just linking it up to the top. There is a very neat, or should I say loose, illustration of what the heel of the shoe is going to look like. Okay. Next step is to draw a reference line for where the back of the shoe is going to be and where the toe of the shoe is going to be. And there it is. Now, for the sake of this, I'm going to pull a line horizontally. Notice that I'm turning the page a lot when I'm drawing, and that's very important because it allows you to get very straight lines. I mean, that line looks pretty accurate, and that's because I've turned the page. That helps me get that reference a bit sharper. So this is an interesting dynamic. Now, of course, this is not how I would normally draw, but for the sake of this exercise, and for the sake of warming up drawings in general, it's very good to have a few reference lines to see where you're going wrong, what you might want to improve. And I'll show you how we're going to get into the details a bit later, once we've roughed out the form and the shape. So the next step would be maybe to highlight the arc that's going to be going between the toe and the tongue of the shoe. And there's a pretty good starting point. Okay, doesn't matter if you make a mistake and you go over that line, if you don't go over the line, if you miss it. It's all to do with being loose and to warm up and to think about how best to display the work itself. Okay, now I'm going to do something a little bit different and design this shoe around a sock style, a sock aesthetic, which I've seen happen quite often lately. I've seen a lot of brands using it. So we're going to pull a line going across, hypothetically, and let's just draw a vertical line down. Again, I'm not fussed or worried about what the drawing looks like. I'm more interested in the proportion, and I think that's a very important technique that you will develop over time, is understanding the importance of proportion when it comes to drawing a shoe. Now, this is by no means perfect, but it at least shows something a little different. Now, the nice thing about using one color is that there's a lot of dynamism to the work. There's a lot of action to it, which is very useful. It's very helpful, and it gives it a bit more appeal. This is a very bizarre looking shoe, I'll admit that. Now, once you've got the general proportions down, you can start with working out the details. So, for example, there's always a lot of detail on the side of the shoe. So for the sake of this exercise, I'm just going to pull 2 diagonal lines down. And you can see there's a very interesting overlay going on here. So the question is, how can we profit off that idea? Because that's something quite interesting. So you might want to draw a reference line from here to here and pull a line across, round off these edges, and design sketching is all about exploring. It's all about exploring, making mistakes, and working out whether or not you're enjoying the style that you're working with. And this is quite an interesting shoe. It almost looks like an Air Jordan. Okay, what I'm going to incorporate this time around is some sort of Velcro strap. Okay, so we have some more reference lines for the laces. I'm going to put laces in inverted commas. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to round off each one of these from edge to edge. Okay, now detail is also important, and once you've got the understanding of the form of the shoe, you can then start working on the smaller details. So for the sake of this, since I want it to be a Velcro shoe, I want to highlight that it maybe has a bit of a rounded feature to it. And what I can do is round off the undersides of the edges. That's quite interesting. I mean, it's very different. And that's what you want. You don't want to design something that's cookie cutter and cliche. You want to try and be a bit unique in the way that you work, and you'll always be interested in what you produce. Okay, now for the underside of the shoe, it's always nice to add some kind of texture. So my go-to is normally just adding some little round stubs on the sole, which gives it a bit more depth. I don't know what you would call this thing. It looks like a hiking boot slash sports shoe. Okay. Now, another very useful tool in your arsenal is hatching. Now, when you're working with one color, it can be very difficult to decide where to use the right line depth and work, and that's all through repetition and practice. You'll get something that might help you. So for the sake of this exercise, I want to communicate that this is some kind of sock-like material. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw some hatching lines across. Again, notice my wrist is pretty loose and my lines are equally spaced out. That comes through repetition and practice, obviously. So I would suggest you start nice and slowly, and you try your hardest to get these lines to be as well spaced apart as possible, because that will indicate that there's some form of control behind the work. Okay. So we have a sock aesthetic on that side. Now I'm wondering how best to highlight these zones. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw another reference line from here to here. Now this is a space that can be used for all sorts of things. So I'm just going to follow the form of the heel that I had underneath, should I say, the sole, and put it through. Now in this zone, you can go wild. You can explore with all sorts of different methods of joinery, making it look good. You know, so I don't know what this thing's turned out to be. It's like a basketball shoe crossed with a hiking boot. Absolutely no idea what it is. What you might also want to add is some more detail on the tongue, so you can add a little pull tab, and on this side you can do the same, some kind of pull tab for the fingers. So we've gone from something extremely basic, an extremely basic form and shape, and we've been able to convert it into something that looks very interesting, highly technical, but interesting nonetheless. And of course, now is the time when you want to communicate depth, you want to communicate detail. So I'm going to repeat what I did in the last exercise and just draw some diagonal lines that are going to be coming across. So this is going to be another Adidas sponsored shoe. Now notice that I added a bit of depth. Each one of these lines has a repeat to it, and that adds that little extra piece of depth. And what I'm going to do now is then define that depth by hatching the drawing. Jeez, I'm not even taking my own advice. These lines are not the same in size. Anyway, we're all learning here. It's all just warming up. So there you see. Now, once you bump it up by hitting it with a bit of a darker, thicker edge, you can see that there is some depth to the shoe. It's a very fun exercise. This is the funnest part of being able to create, is, you know, you don't have an idea in your head to begin with. At least I don't. When I design sketch, I approach it by seeing what the lines do and how best they can communicate themselves. And for this example, I've created a bizarre looking hiking shoe that that looks quite technical, surprisingly. Now, for the sake of this exercise, there are a few details that look good and there are a few details that don't look very good. Like, I'm not too happy with the proportion of these Velcro pieces, but at least they show something. Now, the next step is, once you've got your general form, your basic form down, you might want to go further in and add some shadow and some highlights and some, you know, if you really feel confident, you then pick up your something like a Papermate and you define your edges. For the sake of this, I'm just going to keep it nice and basic and not touch it anymore. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you in places where there might be an important detail to highlight. So what I like to do, and what I find is very useful, is to just draw a little circle showing that that is an important area. Now, say for example, these parts rotate and pivot. In later drawings, I'll show you how I highlight those by doing smaller reference circles, which indicate that it's almost like a hinge mechanism. Because this is a side profile, there's only so much you can do, okay? So this is a good way of highlighting a detail. And in the same way, if I wanted to, you know, highlight that this is a Velcro lace, what you can do very basically is draw a small little reference arrow and write out something that references what you're pointing at. Okay, so it's been a very interesting exercise, and I hope you've learned something from this and you enjoy this format. We're going to get more and more into the details. I'm going to be showing you three-dimensional drawing, of course, very soon.